Today's topic is learning in the Middle Ages, so let's get started. A bit of review is going to help as we talk about today's lesson. This is a very famous Renaissance painting by Raphael called the School of Athens, but it talks a lot about how people gain knowledge and where knowledge comes from. So you may remember this from the Greece unit. On the left side right here, the old dude, that's Plato. And Plato's the philosopher who said that all knowledge comes from above. That's why he's pointing above himself. And he was the one that made the Allegory of the cave and said that we are merely kind of living in the shadow of what the true world is. There's kind of a heavenly realm, and that's where true knowledge is. Now, the guy to the other side, that's his student Aristotle. And if you remember Aristotle, his idea was that knowledge can be found here on earth through logic, through scientific study, things along those lines. So kind of an introduction, and it will make sense here in a minute why I'm bringing up these two different guys. Remember the Allegory of the cave, just to help you guys out. You may remember the video in class, but this came from Plato, right? We are merely prisoners in the cave, and we can't see the full glory of everything else that's around us. And then on the flip side, you got Aristotle. And Aristotle is saying that stuff can be proven through logic. And he's famous for the syllogisms, which are basically logical arguments that form as he goes and says, if this one thing is true, the second thing is true, we can conclude a third thing. So just basic logic, you see this in math. You probably remember the syllogism from before. Now, the reason why I'm bringing all this up is this has been the kind of debate throughout Western philosophy is whose side are you on? So it might be helpful here to draw a little bit of a T-chart. I'll help you out. So on one side, you got the ultimate tennis match, doubles match of all time. You got Plato and St. Augustine versus Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. So Plato, like I said knowledge is limited, and Aristotle says that knowledge is kind of found through logic. Now, these guys weren't Christians. These guys were Greeks, so Christianity didn't exist yet. But for the first 1,000 years or so, everybody went basically the route of Plato. St. Augustine's the most famous. Remember, in the City of God, he says that human flesh is sinful, and where this is merely a shadow of the world of God versus the world of man, and the City of God will ultimately triumph. Aristotle is kind of just pushed to the side. He's not seen as a serious threat. But when Aquinas comes, who I'm going to talk about today, he goes and he says, hey, I actually like Aristotle, and I tend to go more towards that route. So you have these two guys, each having one Greek and one Christian, going and fighting throughout the centuries of how do we discover truth, and it's quite an interesting match to watch. The movement associated with Thomas Aquinas is called Scholasticism. And Scholasticism, like I wrote right down here, it's basically applying logic to Christian faith. Now, you get a lot of critiques of Christianity. How could you believe these things, these stories, that's ridiculous? If you read any of these scholastics, these are smart guys. There's a serious tradition in Christianity of logical thought. And this really stems from Thomas Aquinas. St. Augustine said, he's more Platonic in his views. He said, I believe in order to understand. Scholastics flip this, meaning Scholastic says, I understand in order to believe. Like, I don't need to check my brain at the door in order to understand the Christian faith. So I'm going to talk about Aquinas and his movement and kind of some of the parts of education as well. So here's Mr. Thomas Aquinas, some info on him. He actually was, according to a lot of the primary sources, he was slow, fat, and he was actually in school called the Dumb Ox of Sicily. So he's Italian, he was from Sicily. So in his early days, people really didn't expect much of him, to be honest. He even was going into the priesthood, and his parents even tried to tempt him with a woman to get him out of the priesthood. And rather than becoming a Benedictine monk, which is kind of the respectable monk of the day, he became a Dominican friar, right, after St. Dominic. So that's a beggar, a mendicant. In many ways, it's kind of the not cool order of the day to be a part of. And over a period of years, he comes up with these logical arguments as he's reading Aristotle. And this is best exemplified in his very, very famous book, Summa Theologica, which is basically summary of theology, right? And the goal of this book is to reconcile, to make right this Greek's logical argument that you have with Aristotle with Christian theology. One way that he does this is he kind of does what you see with Sherlock Holmes, via negativa. I can prove what something is by saying what it is not. So like when you see Sherlock Holmes and he's solving the mystery, a lot of times that he thinks about it is if there's a murderer or something like that, if you can say everybody else find who's not the murderer, then the only person left is the murderer. That type of logic, that's what he uses for God, and I'll show you what that looks like. While he's writing Summa Theologica, he technically never finishes it because he has this profound experience where he has like this vision of heaven or something along those lines, and he says, it's so beautiful, I just can't write again. And after this straw experience, everything, he calls it straw experience because everything that he's seen, his work just compares to straw. He doesn't write again, and he just dies a few months later. But the Summa Theological is a very, very famous work that he pens. He, in Summa Theologica, makes 5 logical arguments for why God exists. They're motion, causality, contingency, degrees, and design. So I'm going to talk for a second, write those down, and I'll talk for a second about what those are and how they can be interpreted. It sounds fancier and all this stuff, but it's actually very logical arguments that he makes, and people still love to debate them if they're actually accurate, but I'll talk about them one by one. Okay, here's the first one, is the motion argument. The motion argument says that stuff is in motion. You can pause on here and take a look and write these down, but I'm just going to kind of explain what these are. Stuff is in motion, and if you think about something moving, like if you see a ball rolling down the street, there had to be a source of that ball starting to roll. Like, for example, a child rolls the ball. So he says if stuff is moving, there has to be a first unmoved mover. And he concludes that, well, that could be God, right? The origin of the universe, that can be started by somebody who is not moved in of itself. The second one is causality, which basically says that there's causes and effects. So there is a chain of cause and effect, like kind of like the chicken or the egg type thing. And he concludes, well, the thing that could have started it would have been God. The third part is contingency. I'll let you read here on this one. This one sometimes trips people up a little bit. But when I use the word contingent, it's just something that depends upon something else. And he's saying that the initial sequence of actions created by God went and caused this chain sequence. Degrees is fairly easy to understand. I kind of have a silly picture there. But the idea is that if we can measure something of good, better, best, then there has to be a standard against which we are measuring these. And then you say, well, where does that standard come from? And Aquinas argues if we can measure degrees of something, then there's a perfect standard, a perfect ideal standard, and that comes from God. Design is another part, and the last part of his arguments for the existence of God. And it says basically, if you have something like the house, you see the house that's kind of built really cool, you have to assume that there's a designer and a purpose for this. And remember, with Aristotle, we talked about the telos, the goal that we're working towards. So when he says, if we see something that has a design, who is the designer? And he says God is that designer. Aquinas also makes the 4 moral virtues and the 3 theological virtues. So the moral virtues are not Christian in a large sense. He says they're natural. You can find them out just through like pure logic, and they apply to everybody. And they're not like controversial things, like non-Christians would adhere to those as well. He says prudence, which is basically making good decisions. 2 is justice. 3 is temperance, like not, overdoing it on anything. And then 4 is fortitude, pushing through when circumstances are difficult. So he says everybody can relate to these. These are like normal things. The 3 theological virtues, he said, these are supernatural, meaning they come from God. Like you would not do these on your own, and there's a way of God interacting with the universe in a way that's mysterious. Faith, hope, and charity. And he says the most important one is charity. Now, charity, I'm not just saying giving to others, although that's part of it. Really what I'm saying is love. He said, if you heard, God is love, he says you would never on your own want to do charitable things, loving things, agape love. The only reason you would ever want to do those things is because they come from a transcendent God who's both within our time and space, that we understand him, and also on some other levels that he's not. Now, that's enough on Aquinas. We'll leave it there for now. And now I'm going to talk about the very opposite, in some ways, Peter Abelard, who is also a scholastic. He was very popular. He was the most popular teacher of his day, and people crammed into his lecture halls to go hear him. Like, you had standing room only. Very famous scholastic. So he was like Aquinas in many ways, but he was very, very controversial because he did something that you weren't supposed to do. He had an affair with one of his students. Now, before you gasp at this, there is some evidence that he may have actually been younger than the student. She may have been a little bit older than him or around the same age. So it wasn't like kind of a weird type thing, if that's your concern. He tutored Heloise. They fell in love, and they actually had a kid. His name was Astrolabe, which I pictured right there, which is like kind of a navigation tool. So they were a little bit hippies. But that was not allowed to be, doing this. He was staying in her house, courtesy of Heloise's uncle. And the uncle was none too pleased, and famously, part of the story is he had him castrated, which basically allowed them to be apart for the rest of their lives. They were sent apart by the uncle, and they wrote these famous love letters over the years, and they're really mushy, and they're actually pretty entertaining to read. So if you're interested in reading any of those, you can go check them out. But over a period of years, they wrote these, and they're actually buried next to each other. So it's kind of a famous romance between these two people, and we have this through these correspondences of these love letters. So Abelard, not the theology as much, although I will say he actually is very brilliant as well, but not as famous on the theological level as Aquinas. And then the last thing I want to talk about is just the university of life. Like, why would you wear, on graduation, you wear these robes? Where does this come from? It comes from the Middle Ages. So in the Middle Ages, you typically have the town, they're built in a town, and then you have the gown, right? What people are wearing, these lovely gowns, which typically represents in these cities college students who are wild and crazy, like the reputations you have today. The town's hating them. That's one reason the colleges have walls around them, is to keep the crazy kids in there. And there's a lot of famous universities that come out that you've probably heard of. University of Paris is huge, Oxford and Cambridge in England. And then there's different levels of education. For example, today where we get these terms, bachelor is typically a 4-year degree, master is another 1 to 2 years, and then a doctorate, depending on the numbers of years. During the Middle Ages and today, they're slightly different, but 9 years is kind of the number thrown around out there. This is after high school is what I'm saying, like on today's level. But university life was kind of interesting, very boring. The lecturer just read straight from the text for up to 6 hours at a time, and students just took notes. Very tedious, and it is, in some ways, the origin of our educational system, but thank God it's a little bit more exciting than that. So there you have it, a little bit about Aquinas, a little bit about Peter Abelard, and a little bit about why you wear those robes on graduation day.